Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Dr. Gill and I am the host of this show, The Vitality Hour for BYP TV, Broadcast Your Passion. And we are here today in the marvellous London, England. This is the River Thames. And I'm so relieved to tell you that finally we've got some sunshine here in the UK. We've had lots of snow. I don't know if you're aware of it, because I know some of you are watching from all over the world. It's been an exceptional winter for us. And tomorrow, officially, we just had the spring equinox, and today when I'm filming this, tomorrow is officially the first day of spring. Our clocks go forward, or whatever it is. So there's a good feeling in the air. There's a good vibe in the air in the UK at the moment. So wherever you are in the world, I hope that you're looking forward to the change of your season, if that's happening for you too. So what's my Vitality Hour all about? Well, this show really is all about giving you, the viewer, the opportunity to understand everything holistic, basically. So I'm particularly interested in functional medicine and particularly interested in functional nutrition. But as my own journey back to health and happiness has happened, I've realised more and more, and now there's loads of scientific evidence to prove it, that the body is also attached to the mind and the mind is also attached to the body. So although some of my shows will be and have focused on using food as medicine, the idea of this particular show is to open up you to the world of holistic, complementary and alternate therapies. And sometimes I will bring people here to sit with me who have extraordinary stories to tell you, perhaps of recovery from all sorts of diseases, but I also bring in experts in their field who are going to be able to open your mind perhaps a little bit to other ways of dealing with the modern way that we live our lives in the 21st century and all the stresses and strains that we all experience. And that goes for our children as well, of course. So today, my theme is not so much about the physical body, it's really about the mind. And so we're going to talk about mindset matters. And one of the great things about this, I really had already planned to do this show even before the death of Professor Stephen Hawkins fairly recently, because I've been doing lots of research about the etiology of disease and why some people succumb to disease and others not. Why is it that two sisters will have the same breast cancer gene, like the BRCA gene, and one will go on to develop breast cancer but the other won't? Why is it that some people are more susceptible to things like Parkinson's and dementia and others not? Why is it that we're getting more and more people susceptible to things like autoimmune diseases such as fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, ME? What is going on? There's got to be more than what they are putting in their mouth. There's got to be more to how much exercise they're having. There's got to be more than what's happening to the body itself. And so my research has been recently looking at how the mind affects illness, affects how you feel today and how it affects you going forward to the future, and also how your past affects what's happening to you now and what might happen to you in the future. And this is particularly relevant because of the passing just this month of Professor Stephen Hawking, who suffered from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, otherwise known as motor neurone disease. So if you don't know the story, he was diagnosed at the age of 20. He was a young man who was at Cambridge University, and he was already recognised as being exceptionally bright, but actually he was a geeky boy. When he was at school, he was kind of awkward and skinny and geeky, and I think he was probably goaded and bullied somewhat, but perhaps secretly admired by some other people as well. He lived a life of academia because his parents were both from Cambridge University, and his father in particular was quite demanding in terms of what Stephen should achieve, and indeed they put him up for a scholarship to get into one of the best schools at the age of 11. He actually was ill on the day that he was supposed to do the entrance exam and never got to that school. And that's really relevant to the rest of his story, I think, because when he got to university and he was away from his parents, his life became very different. He had a nice time at university, like we all do, I certainly did. And his academic studies were kind of really not that important. I think he was heard to say that he basically was working an hour a day. And one of the things that's really interesting is that this 2 years or three or 4 years that he spent being an able-bodied person at university suddenly changed when he was diagnosed with motor neurone. And as his physical body started to deteriorate, which it did relatively quickly for this disease, so he focused more on his academic studies. And what's very interesting to me is that he was the exception to the rule for motor neurone disease, because the majority of people that are diagnosed with ALS or motor neurone, majority don't live beyond 10 years. 50% of people barely make it to 5 years. And yet Professor Stephen Hawkins, he lived for 55 years. So I was really interested to know about that and other people that have survived those diseases or outlived their prognosis, or maybe have succumbed to illness. What is going on here, and why would Stephen Hawkins be so extraordinarily different from the majority of people? And in the book, When the Body Says No, by an eminent scientist and medic called Gabor Mate, he talks about ALS being put down to certain types of people. And ALS particularly is seen in people who have had significant emotional repression as a child, or they have had a lack of connection with their parents as children. And certainly what we know from Stephen Hawking's biographer is that that household was very academic. There was no conversation at the dinner table. It was all about academia. The house wasn't really taken care of. And there was very little connection between Stephen and his parents. And indeed, as his disease progressed, his parents had absolutely no input into taking care of him. That was all left to his wife, Jane, who kind of came in as the rescuer and helped Stephen to function so that he could do all of the things that he needed to do. And what's fascinating is that Stephen recognised that, and actually said that he felt kind of privileged, if you like, to live a life of the mind. And it's almost like somebody that is deigned for this world of academia was the right person, if you like, or the ideal person to suffer with motor neurone, because motor neurone is a complete degeneration of the body, but the mind stays intact. And he makes reference to the fact it was almost like by developing this disease, he was able to focus more on the scientific developments and the theory of everything, and that he probably or possibly would not have achieved had he not been diagnosed with this extraordinary disease. So it's really fascinating to me to look at the etiology of all of that, and the physiology and the relationship between the mind and the body, and how you can have mind over matter. And certainly you can have two people that suffer with a debilitating disease, and one of them can give up and stay in bed, and the other one can live a full life. So there has to be more to what's going on here than just the diagnosis, the symptoms, the way that somebody lives their life, and their attitude to the way that they live their life has to have a significant contribution to their lifespan. So with that in mind, I'd already decided, that this was going to be my topic of today, because I have a very special guest for you on today's show. And I'm going to bring him on shortly, and his speciality is all about self-determination and mindset, and having this positive attitude, and realizing that just because your life was as it is, that doesn't have to stay there. And certainly the people that I work with, and from my own journey, I know that every one of you has the same opportunity to live life to the full within your capacity. And there are lots of stories in that book, When the Body Says No, that give you examples of how other people with extraordinary lifestyles and with extraordinary stories to tell will be able to be identified to where that disease came from. And a lot of it is to do with trauma, particularly as a very young child, separation. There is a breast cancer type, for example, which is well recognised and scientifically identified. The trauma of a birth for some people actually can drip over into the way that they live their lives and to the manifestation of disease. So for me, it's a really fascinating piece of work, and now it's very acceptable, and even kind of conventional medics such as Gabor Mate are looking at this and understanding that we are so much more than the cells, the physical cells of our body. We are much more to do with that mind-body connection. So every show we have a little section called Gill's Gems, where I answer questions that have been sent in to me or phoned into me or emailed into me. And indeed, I just want to say to you that if you have a burning question or something that you'd like covered as the main part of the show, please get in touch with us. You can also look at previous episodes of my Vitality show and other people's shows on the byptv.live website. But please get in contact. So if you'd like me to cover something that maybe you're suffering with, or somebody that you know, something that you're not sure about and you'd like more information and you'd rather not rely on Dr. Google, which, let's face it, most of us do, please send it in to us so that we can get the relevant experts here to answer your questions, because I don't know everything. And also we can give you perhaps some good examples and get some people in that may be in a similar situation to you. But today's Gill's Gem is sent to us by Julie, and she's got a question about arthritis. So she's just beginning to suffer a little bit with stiffness in her joints, particularly in her larger joints. So not hands so much, but knees and ankles and her big toe. So big toe is particularly associated with gout, but they're all kind of linked really. So she wants to know, she doesn't really want to take medication. Well done, Julie. Unless she really, really needs to. But is there a way that she can cope with her arthritis in another way, in a more holistic way? So yes, is the answer to that. And in fact, I am a lady of a certain age, so I'm in my late 50s now. And what you need to know is that all of us have bones and joints that degenerate as we get older. And that's to do with the fact that we stand up and there is this stuff called gravity. So to a lesser or greater degree, we all have kind of slightly arthritic bones. It's very common to have arthritic type knees for anybody that's over the age of 50, 55. And some of you probably know that I teach Pilates. So a lot of the people that I help come to me very often with kind of achy and creaky joints. So the first thing to say that you might not have thought about, Julie, though, is that one of the theories behind arthritis, if you look at the kind of energy healing work that is done by people like Ines Segal or Louise Hay, You Can Heal Your Life, if you look at those books, to look at the kind of basis of disease and how disease manifests itself and why we develop things in later years or even in earlier years, is that they both agree that arthritis, and this may not be relevant for you, but I'm just going to tell you what they say, is that arthritis is very associated with carrying stress around. So it is very stress related, and you may well have noticed this, Julie, but if you haven't noticed this, then just keep an eye and notice when your pains are more pronounced, for example, and just have a think about, well, what was my life been like this week or this month? And it's particularly associated with feeling unloved, with resentment, and with carrying guilt or shame. And so one of the ways that you can address arthritis and those kinds of pains and aches that you get is to perhaps look from a mindset point of view, look back at maybe what's happened and find some therapies that might be able to talk you through some of those issues that you may be aware of, or maybe not even aware of, because we're very good at suppressing things, aren't we? So relationship counselling, that kind of thing. Meditation is marvellous for any illness, of course, but also exercise. And a lot of people that I see that have back pain and arthritis and joint stiffness, they're frightened of exercising. And this happened to me. I was 39 when I was diagnosed with bursitis in both my hips. And I went to a conventional rheumatologist who gave me some cortisol into my hip bursas, which is like being kicked with a horse, I have to tell you, and did nothing for, well, it did something for about 3 months and then it came back. And he basically said to me, well, you're just going to have to go on painkillers for the rest of your life. And the fear at that point really kicked in, because I honestly thought that I was going to end up in a wheelchair, that there was no hope for me, that I wasn't going to be able to live the life that I thought I was going to live. And that fear actually made the pain worse, if you see what I mean, because fear actually is probably one of the things that holds us all back, but it particularly holds the body back from recovering and from living that life of joy. Now, fortunately, I found a wonderful physiotherapist who knew exactly what was going on and was able to reassure me that this wasn't a life sentence at all, and that I could manage this with posture exercises, and also by finding myself a really good Pilates teacher. And I've been with my wonderful Pilates teacher, Sarah Andrews, hi Sarah, for about 18 years, and now teach Pilates myself because I think the whole world should do Pilates. So finding something like a really good form of exercise, non-weight bearing exercise, is really good, Julie. And then finding the alternate treatments and therapies that might suit you. So whether that's shiatsu or acupuncture, whether it's massage treatment, I would certainly recommend some nutritional therapies. The body's an amazing thing. If it's lacking in certain nutrients, it will show up. It will shout at you like a light on your dashboard. You know, when you're running out of fuel, the light comes on and says, give me fuel. And your body's the same. If it's coming up with a symptom, wherever it is, it's flashing this light at you and says, actually, you might not be drinking enough. You might not have enough vitamin D3 in order to keep your bones. Or magnesium. Magnesium is a relaxant, and your body can't function very well without sufficient amounts of magnesium, because the lack of magnesium pulls the joints out of away in different in different directions, and brings your joints out of alignment. And this in itself can be a reason for you to get knee problems. So really good high quality nutritional therapy, and you can see some of the stuff that I use on my website. Food choices is a really interesting one as well. Now, fairly recently, I was finding it really difficult to go up and down the stairs because I kind of had a pain at the top of my foot here, and to go upstairs was really uncomfortable. And even though I'd been talking to people for many, many years with my functional nutritional background about dropping deadly nightshade family out of their diet, I'd never actually done it myself, because nothing had really, I hadn't had enough of a prod to do anything about it. But this was becoming a pain, it was becoming uncomfortable, and I thought, well, actually, do you know what, I'm going to give this a go. So deadly nightshade family are things like potatoes, white potatoes, aubergines, peppers, tomatoes. So all of those foods, courgettes are okay, I dropped out of my diet, because it turned out I ate a lot of tomatoes because we grow them at home apart from anything else. And I can honestly say within 2 weeks this pain went away, and this pain has stayed away. And the reason for dropping the nightshade family is that these nightshade family produce these things called lectins, which are kind of large proteins. And these lectins, these large proteins, are in the nightshade family but in other foods as well. I don't have time to talk to you about lectins today, but there is, I believe there's a blog on my website that explains to you about nightshades and lectins, and where else we can get lectins from as well, and how to avoid them. So I hope that's helped. So water, exercise, trying to cut out that nightshade family might well help you. Finding some alternate treatments, making sure that you're doing some gentle exercise, and really sorting out what is it that is upsetting me? Is there something in my life that's stressful or that's toxic to me? How can I take more care of myself? And this next section that we're going to do in this show actually concentrates a little bit on how really looking after yourself is so beneficial, not only for your body, but for your mind as well. So welcome back to the Vitality Hour with me, Gill Barham. And this is the moment that we've all been waiting for, because I have my special guest with me. So we've been talking about mind over matter, mindset matters, everything to do with mind-body connection in this show today. So if you've missed it, please make sure that you go back to the beginning. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce somebody that is very focused. He is actually a bit of a health freak himself, by his own admission, but his main focus really is on helping people to reset their thoughts, reset their minds, I suppose. And he is the author of the book, The Thinking Revolution, and indeed the program that goes along with it. This is his book, The Thinking Revolution, here. And so I'd like to introduce you today to my very special guest, Dene Stewart.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Right.
It's a thrill to be here.
Oh, good. I'm pleased.
Yeah.
On this beautiful, sunny day. Hurrah!
Isn't it wonderful?
Yeah, it is
What a lovely
absolutely
backdrop.
wonderful. So, Dene, you've heard, or you've been here whilst we've done the first part of the show.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about resonates with you because we've had those conversations before. So we are going to talk about the Thinking Revolution in just a moment. But just to give our viewers a little bit of a background, would you mind sharing with us kind of what where you came from to get to this point?
Sure.
Would you mind?
No problem at all. Well, my story, if you like, a brief version of the story, is that I pretty much had everything. I had the great job, the glamorous job in the 22nd floor office with the panoramic view over London, the big salary that went with that, the beautiful wife, the 2 children, the Mercedes in the gravel drive, the big house, the lot. And then it all started to go wrong. And when it started to go wrong, it went wrong in a big way.
So how long ago was this?
We're talking now around about, that beautiful picture was actually about 15 or so years, 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And around about that time, I also developed Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Wow.
And things started to go wrong.
So your health, and then what, your relationships as well?
My health went, excuse me, then through various cycles of employment. I was mostly in the corporate world, mm-hmm. and of course, as the corporate world cycles, I found myself, I reached the sort of, I would say almost like the pinnacle of the career I chose.
Mm-hmm. Which was?
In media. I was in media sales for one of the big national newspapers. Mm-hmm. Very glamorous job and very exciting. And but that came a point where I wanted to move on. But as that happened, I then found myself in a very perilous job, and I lost that. I was made redundant for the first time.
And that was a shock, no doubt.
Yes, if I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but at the same time, I think it's almost something that you have to go through. It's a real life-changing and life-enhancing experience in a very odd way.
Well, I think it depends how you look at it. My husband was made redundant out of the blue several years ago, and it was such a shock for him. But immediately, I was very positive, and I said, well, actually, you've always wanted to run your own business. Yeah. You were never going to walk away from that salary. So now you've got the opportunity to do what you've always wanted to do, because somebody's given you a bit of a nudge. They've given you a bit of money so that we can live for the next 3 months. And his life has never looked back since. He's never been happier. We've never been happier. And so it depends how you look at it.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things I learned, because a few years later I got, so I then spent a few years out of the corporate world, trying to do my own thing. I'd always had this bit of an entrepreneurial spirit, but never quite managed to make it happen. So, and then I got back into the corporate world again, just before the 2008 crash happened. And I went in very positive, thinking I'd be in a very commercially positive role. But within 3 months, I was starting to make other people redundant.
That's not nice.
And I spent 4 years doing that.
Yeah.
And what I saw was exactly what the picture that you've just described. Some people, it was a new lease of life.
Yeah.
And for some people, it was the end of the world.
Yeah.
And then after 4 years, after I'd been right-sizing, as they say, I got right-sized myself.
Yes.
So suddenly I was made redundant again for the second time.
And there's no support, really, because once you're out of that HR world, because you're gone,
Yeah.
there's nobody there to kind of bring you back together and piece you, unless you've got somebody that's around you that's resourceful. It's very traumatic. It's not the trauma necessarily of the redundancy for some people. It's actually that fear of being unsupported and not being part of something anymore, and the fear of moving forward into the unknown. Would you agree?
I do, and I think another key part of this is how much of our identity is wrapped up in what we do and where we work.
Yeah.
And of course, when that gets taken away from you, actually, and you lose part of your identity, that's a huge thing.
Yeah.
And of course, that's what happened to me.
Yeah.
And so in a very short space of time, I had the health issues, my marriage broke down, I lost my job for the second time, I moved out of the house, and the biggest fear that I had was I was going to lose my children as well. And I mean spiritually lose them, psychologically lose them.
Yes.
There was no issue that I would lose them from a physical contact point of view. There was never any issue like that. My concern was I would lose them from a dad-children relationship point of view.
Well, physically not being present for as much as you are used to being present is significant in itself, isn't it?
That's right. So that was the background, and so I'd moved into this flat, and it was the dark night of the soul, as they say. And I was sitting there feeling very sorry for myself, and the thought came to me that actually I had been the architect of everything that happened.
The thought came to you, so this was a thinking revolution.
It was indeed.
Oh my goodness me.
It was indeed, yes.
So that was your light bulb moment.
Yeah, and the thing was, I'd sort of started to recognise it some months earlier. As to be honest, I was very lucky. I had some friends, and they could recognise within me that I was mentally going downhill. And I had a very good friend of mine said, "Dean, get some help."
Sometimes it takes somebody else to recognise that in you, don't you? Because you're so, if anybody's suffered with depression before, you're so in the depths of that depression that you don't really notice what's going on.
That's so true. Absolutely.
It's only when you come out the other side and you look back and you think, oh my goodness,
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And so I was very grateful to my friend for pointing this out to me, although I probably wasn't grateful at the time. It was one of those sort of gratitude in retrospect moments. But what it made me do was start looking at this whole idea of self-development. To be honest, she was really referring to things like therapy or psychoanalysis or something like that, or counselling. And I had a look at those, and I just did not want it. There was something, as I researched it and looked into it, I just did not.
Didn't resonate with you.
So I started to look at all sorts of other stuff, and what I started to see was it wasn't just me, and that was kind of reassuring.
Yeah.
And the more research I did, I kept coming up against one particular phrase, and you may have heard this phrase, and I don't know, maybe you've come across this as well. The answer lies within you.
Yeah.
Have you had that?
Yes, I have indeed.
So I thought, great, the answer lies within me. What is it?
Yes.
But no one
when
told me.
When are you going to tell me?
Exactly. They say the answer lies within you, but they don't tell you.
Yeah.
And that got me very frustrated, and I started to think, okay, well, I sort of get it, but how do I get at it? And that's really what sort of put me on the path to doing the research that I did and pulling the various strings together. And to be honest, the more research I did, I started to get mad inside, because what I started to see was the knowledge has been there for thousands of years.
Yes.
But it's just not put together in a way that makes it easy to access.
No.
It's certainly not something that's taught in our schools.
Definitely not.
And unless you're lucky enough to have someone in your life who's already aware of that, how are you going to get introduced to it? And yet it's there.
Yes.
And it could have been so much help to me in my early life, because it was so interesting hearing some of the things you said about Stephen Hawkins some of the things, words that you were using around the idea of disease and the mind-body connection and fear.
Do you think that your diagnosis, your cancer diagnosis, was related to something that had happened to you or the way that you were living your life?
Yeah. Once I'd come through that and I started to think about it, the connection that I made was, for most of my life, and I'm talking the best part of, so I was 40-ish when the diagnosis was made. I was sort of 50, early 50s by the time I was starting to have the retrospective thinking, by the time the marriage had broken up, and I had that sort of time to think. And what I could see was, for all of my life, and I use that word advisedly, all of it, I'd lived in a state of anxiety, stress, and fear.
So even though you had this, what sounds like a very middle-class, normal background,
absolutely,
which from other people on the outside looking in would have said, oh, Dean's got a lovely life. He's got, they've got lovely cars and they've got a nice house and he's got good education. So what was it about that situation that was the stress and the fear? Are you willing to share with us that?
Yeah, I think I should. I think it's important, but I think I'd like to preface it by saying what I say now is in no way meant to be pointing fingers at anybody.
No, absolutely not.
It's really important that whatever anyone sort of listening takes from this is that I own this, I take responsibility for this. But the fact is that my upbringing, although, yes, very comfortable, very middle class, and I have no... I can't bring out one of those stories that says I had to fight against the injustices of the world. I didn't.
Yeah.
But the difficulties that my mother and father had to grow up with, and they were significant, led to them having a very closed and a very distrustful view of life.
Yes.
And that got imprinted in me.
Well, I'm so, we are definitely on the same page, because that is all the evidence, that is all the scientific evidence that I was talking about earlier, that somebody like Gabor Maté himself, his mother abandoned him when he was a year old because she thought that she was going to get put in a concentration camp. Yeah. And so the way that your parents live their lives through no fault of their own then becomes their norm, and it becomes your norm. Yeah. And it's not something that they can control. It's not something, as you say, that you can be cross or angry about, or that you can blame. There's no blame here. No. But this also means, and I think this is why what you do is so important, is that awareness is the key of that stuff that went on. And I had a very similar background in that, my parents, their relationship was very difficult at times, and I felt in the middle of that always. Yeah. And I could blame them for how I feel about that kind of situation, but actually it was only the stuff that happened from their previous generation, and that previous generation probably was imprinted by their previous generation. So we're not just this physical being here. Yeah. We are so linked, and we were talking about spirituality earlier.
You were, absolutely.
We're so linked to everything that has happened for probably generations before. Yeah. So, I completely get what you mean, and I also get that there is no blame, there is no, you're taking ownership for it. Yeah. The only thing that we can do as parents now is to say, well, I'm not going to do that for my children. I'm going to make sure that as much as possible I don't pass that, culture or whatever you want to call it, on to my children, and therefore we're going to break that kind of cycle, if you like. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think the key word that you used was awareness, because what I've come to realize, and through the research that I've done and everything that I've looked at, is that this thing up here between the
6 inches.
Yeah, that's it. It works at the subconscious level, at the unconscious level. It's what we unconsciously believe to be true about ourselves, about the way the world works, about our ability to fulfill our needs. And I know that there's probably a lot of people watching who believe in positive mantras and chanting and probably got really great things to say about it. For me personally, I've found that didn't work. And what has worked for me is getting underneath the skin how the mind works, why it works that way. And that's really what I've tried to capture in the Thinking Revolution, because my perspective is if you understand something, then you can do something about it.
Yes. So it's a bit like you knowing, no, I don't need to know how my car works. I just know it's red. Yeah. And I push a button and it starts and off it goes. Yeah. For you and for maybe some other people that are watching, they need the facts and figures, they need the scientific studies, they need to get down and dirty into the detail.
Absolutely.
But that's not to say that your book and your programs are not relevant for both, because even though I know you know that, I love the fact that my mechanic can look after my car. Yeah. It doesn't mean I'm not going to go to him because he knows all the details. In fact, I'm more likely to go to him because he knows the details.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It's a great analogy. I use the analogy of a car a lot myself. However, when it comes to thinking about your mind, I think there's a danger of saying I can give my mind over to a mechanic.
Yeah.
You know, I really do. And I think, you know, this is why perhaps counselling and thinking about some of those psychotype therapies I was a bit resistant to. It was the idea that actually I was giving my mind over to somebody else.
Yes, and we were talking at lunchtime today with another gentleman that we were having lunch with, and he was the same. He was saying, I don't want that hypnotherapy thing because for pretty much that reason, really. And it's not to say that that's not a viable thing to do. And I've got friends who are hypnotherapists and specialists in that area. Yeah. But as you say, for some people it's like handing over the job to somebody else. You know, I've got a plumber that sorts that, I've got an electrician that does that. But personal responsibility at the end of the day is really the only thing that is going to make the real difference. Would you agree?
Yes, we only met a couple of weeks ago at an International Women's Day conference, and you saw me talking about self-determination.
Yes.
And it's an absolute key thing for me. And I think where I position the Thinking Revolution is you can think of there being like a spectrum of ways of thinking about this whole mind thing. So at the one end, you've got, you might call them the scientific, the
black and white.
The black and white, like the cognitive behavioral therapy approaches and the real sort of establishment way of dealing with the mind and thinking. On the other hand, you might have what would be colloquially called the woo-woo.
The woo-woo. I love the woo-woo stuff.
And so for me, when I was sort of trying to work out why everything had happened, I mean, you know, without wishing to sound like I'm blowing my own trumpet, you know, I'm an intelligent guy. Yeah. I know that. But I still managed to, can I say, cock things up?
Yeah, you can say that.
Yeah. I mean, and at the end of it, I'm thinking, how did this happen? Yeah. Why did this happen?
Yeah.
You know? And so I couldn't find the things that related to me. So I ended up doing it myself. Yeah. And I think it sits nicely somewhere in the middle. So the woo-woo stuff, if you'd have been talking to me 5, 6, 7 years ago, I'd have been very, very cynical about it.
Yeah, sure.
The establishment stuff, I'd have been very, very resistant to. But what I now see is that actually they're all trying to do the same thing. Yeah. And that is to connect us to who we really are, so that we can actually live the lives we're really meant to live.
Yes, and the body's an amazing thing. You know, it will heal itself, but awareness, as you say, is the key, because in order for the body to heal itself, you've kind of got to be aware of the signals that it's giving you here, not way in the distance when things are so bad that all of the lights on your dashboard are on. Absolutely. You really want to address one light on your dashboard at a time, don't you? And that's the same with mental illness, of course, is that, you know, the more aware we become of those feelings of self-inadequacy or loathing or doubt or depression or whatever, the more we're able to get help and to be in that physical state to recognize it and to reach out. Yeah. But as you did, and actually to a degree I did, it kind of went on for so long, and you were sort of down here somewhere. It took somebody else to do that for you. And of course, this is the world that we live in now, and why we've got so many problems, particularly with mental health. And with young men, you know, committing suicide, you know, this is still the biggest cause of death for men under the age of 40 is committing suicide, sadly. That repression of emotion, that kind of inability to express themselves because of the typical male expectation, is still in this day and age rendering this world, in this world, this wonderful world, this Western world that we live in, is still actually manifesting in people suffering with mental disease to the extent that they feel that they can't go on.
Yeah, and a phrase I like to use is the idea of mental fitness, but of course even that term, mental fitness, is wrapped in legal terms if you start to talk to people about whether they're mentally fit.
Yes.
So an analogy I would use is one that you wouldn't just decide, if you've never run a marathon before, I mean it's a Friday today.
Yes.
You wouldn't decide to go on and run a marathon on Sunday.
No.
You'd take months, if not longer, to train for it. And yet we're sort of put into this world with no real training on how to think to get the best out of our minds, our brains, and how it links with our body, so that we can be the best person we can be. There's just no training that we are put in to help us to achieve that. And yet we're on this marathon of life, and we go into it without any training.
Yes, and it almost gets worse when you come out of school and education, because you really are kind of, off you go.
Absolutely.
There you go, off you go. And you're away from your parents, and nowadays, particularly in, not maybe in Asian and Afro-Caribbean communities where they are much more linked, but certainly it's very typical now for white British families to live all over England and the UK and even the world, and so this disconnection of these families and communities is really a very significant factor, isn't it, on mental health, and which ultimately kicks into physical health.
Well, one of the things that I talk about in the book is the need to understand your needs. And that connection, that family connection, the connection that we have with friends, is a core need that we all have. And if we feel that we can't fulfill that need, it creates a very strong emotional response within us. And if we aren't adept at understanding that emotional response and how to deal with it, then it can lead to the sorts of issues you've been talking about repression and how we then try and squash that, how that then affects the body. And the ramifications for this are huge. And so the one thing I really want to try and do with the thinking revolution and with the book and all the work I've done is to bring out this idea that actually, just like with the body, if you want to do something, you're going to train for it. And it doesn't matter what it is. If you want to be a carpenter, you can't just pick up a chisel. You have to learn how to use it and use the tools of the trade. If you want to run, you've got to learn how to, you've got to train your body and build your stamina. We've got to do the same things with our minds. And the great thing is, it doesn't matter when you start. This idea that the brain reaches its peak at 25 or 26, whatever, is now known to be nonsense. The brain is continually rewiring itself. It's continually able to make new connections. And the only limiting factor on it is whether you want to do it or not.
So from your kind of recovery, when did you decide that you needed to share what you knew with everybody else? So how did that come about?
It came about after my second redundancy. So it was April 2012, and the world of media the world of media that I was in was shrinking fast, and I just didn't want to be one of those middle-level execs fighting for a shrinking number of jobs to, preserve an image of a career. And I decided that I was going to make the break and follow something that I was truly interested in. And the reality is that I've been interested in this stuff since I was about 16. And because I couldn't see a way of turning it into a career that was going to be exciting, that was going to be rewarding. And all of the glamour stuff. But also there was another factor to it. When I was at that age, the idea of positive psychology was only in its infancy. I mean, it wasn't even public at that time. There was no momentum behind it. So my image of psychology at that time was you were dealing with sick people, ill people, and I didn't want that. And that might sound selfish.
Well, it's very similar to what I do, is that I don't focus on illness. You know, when I worked in the National Health, it's all focused around illness. My complete focus now is on wellness. And it's the same thing. It's a changing of the language, a changing of the perception. And some people tend to live in that identification of being ill or mentally ill.
Absolutely.
And the difference between one person with a chronic disorder and another, as I say, that one will just take to their bed and the other one will live a full life, means that it has to be more than physiological.
Absolutely.
And therefore the way that we think, and I think this is why, you know, the Thinking Revolution and programs like yours are so important, and particularly, as you say, for our younger people. Now I know that you've got a whole workshop and process and programs based around this. So where can we find more? I mean, this is your wonderful book, so presumably we can get that off your website.
Yes, that's on the website, thethinkingrevolution.com.
And what else is on there?
So I've devised a number of digital programs which are downloadable. I've got one that's a free starter program. The thing that I would really say is the backbone of the Thinking Revolution is the idea of personal mastery. And so I've created a free 6-part training program which you can get from the Thinking Revolution website, and it's designed to help you start the first steps of personal mastery. It's called the Start Afresh Blueprint, and it's for anybody who's reached that point where they just think, do you know what, I've had enough, I want a fresh start. And one of the hardest things about making a fresh start, and I don't know whether you found this, is where do you start?
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but at the same time, I can't keep going on with what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Now, it might be a big thing, or it could be a small thing, but the principles are the same, and they're all in that free 6-part training.
And the great thing about that training is that you can kind of do it at your own pace.
Absolutely.
So you don't have to do it in 6 weeks. You can do each module. And I have to say also, even if you're not at that point, it's really good for young people as well. You know, this is an educational tool for anybody that buys it and passes on, you know, to your teenage children. I think would be a fantastic thing to do as well.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I've had actually is because I also work on a one-to-one basis with private clients.
Yeah.
And I've actually had a couple of parents, to be honest, at the stage where they were almost pulling their hair out with worry about their children.
Yeah.
One was a fairly mature child, and the other one a bit younger. But they'd invested in me because of their ability to understand where the processes and where the thinking comes from, because it's there.
I hear an awful lot, you know, I'm a bit sick of it actually, of people talking about the new millenniums and millennials, whatever they are. You know, my children are in their 20s and, oh, you've had it easy and it's good for you. I think, you know, from my perspective, my kids at teenagers and now into their 20s, I've had it really tough.
Couldn't agree more. My children are 24 and 22.
Yeah.
And I've always been of the belief that they have had to work much harder than I did at school. They were under much more pressure to make decisions earlier.
Yeah.
And
social pressures. You name it. And to be honest, I'm very, very proud of them. I think they've come through it. They're now carving their own way in the world. And you know, I just would love to be able to you know, give them that little helping hand. So the books are both, you know, dedicated to the kids. Oh, that's really nice.
And of course, getting them to read them is another matter.
Yeah, but if somebody else gives it to them.
Exactly.
I have a little story. I've been telling my youngest daughter that she needs magnesium. We all need magnesium, by the way, because we're all deficient in it. And she said, "Oh, Mum," she said, "you know, I don't have my aches and pains anymore." She said, "because my friend's mum told me to take magnesium."
Yeah.
Well, I've been telling her that for years, because somebody else did it. So you're not alone.
No.
As parents, we all have the same experience. Now, listen, Dean, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you for the
I think we
invitation.
could go on and speak forever. But you know, I think if you're in any doubt as to whether or not you need this, I think everybody needs this. And I've certainly dipped into your your free thing to take a look, and I would highly recommend you starting there. It's a good place to start, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. And please make sure that you put up your. So, what is your website? TheThinkingRevolution.com.
TheThinkingRevolution.com.
Okay, so we'll make sure that that's up and everybody can link with you. Okay. And you're on Facebook as well.
I'm on
and
Facebook.
LinkedIn?
I'm on LinkedIn, and yes, I think that's about it. I've got Twitter. Yeah,
Twitter account.
So yeah, it's pretty easy to contact me if you want to.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So that concludes the Vitality Hour for this show, and I look forward to seeing you the next time.